All right, we're here with Eric Nelson, a former expatriate that lived in
China.
Shanghai, any?
Just west of Shanghai, a town called Suzhou, about 100 kilometers west of Shanghai.
Okay. So, prior to your assignment, had you had any language, cultural, or business training relating to the do's and don'ts of operating in a different country?
The language training I did have because I studied Chinese in university.
Okay.
So that was my undergraduate degree. So I did have some form of language training before I went, which was one of the reasons I was selected in the first place. The cross-cultural piece and sort of the business piece were things that were more learned when I got there. There are things that you, on a base level that were explained to say, don't do this. Certain things like when you hand your business card, you use two hands to hand your business card.
Right.
Basic things like that were explained. Mm-hmm. But that only most of those nuances and cultural differences were picked up once I actually arrived there. And it's very difficult to give a complete list of all the do's and don'ts because you're just simply not necessarily in those situations, or you don't know what those situations might be.
Right. So when it comes to barriers, it was basically on the job training.
There was a lot of that. I think the companies that I worked with and the companies that I worked for probably could have done a much better job of providing a little bit more framework to actually operating on the ground there.
Okay.
In terms of expectations and some of the laws, particularly where you're interacting with the local labor force and you're working with a bunch of locals, but at the same time you're not always familiar with those laws and legal frameworks and HR issues in this case that maybe could get you into trouble, or maybe you didn't fill out the right paperwork when people were sort of applying for the job, that sort of thing. But you had local guidance and local HR professionals that were helping with that process. Right. But I think on a corporate level, those kind of those pieces of information were probably important to at least understand.
Definitely. What
kind of things to consider or what to look for.
Exactly.
So that at least you know what questions to ask.
Right, and what to be prepared for living, not only working. So.
Well, that's right, and then the living piece is a whole other part, but I was sort of more focusing the answer on the professional side.
Right. So had you traveled overseas before this potential assignment?
I did, yeah. I spent my junior year in university in China. This is back in the late 80s, so there was very little interaction between Chinese and foreigners. I mean, they had never seen anyone with blue eyes before.
Right.
Not ever, but a lot of the local population had sort of not ever seen foreigners or weren't exposed to too many foreigners. So for me, that was really the first trial by fire going into living in a foreign country, and I think that part of that experience helped to shape the next steps of actually taking expatriate experiences and sort of accepting them simply because I had that experience at a young age and really wanted to see, hey, there's so much more I can learn. What are some of the things that are out there? So.
Right. While you were over there, how long did it take you to get acclimated to living there, and how did your new colleagues welcome you?
I think in the case of one of my projects that I was involved with, it took me a while to get settled in because we were living in what is considered to be a second-tier city in China, which is not a major metropolis like Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou or Hong Kong, where it's pretty developed for the most part. We were 100 kilometers to the west of Shanghai in a town called Suzhou, and while it's quite big by Western standards, it's down about 6 to 7 million people, it really didn't have a lot of the infrastructure and support systems, and on a very base level, I mean, when we first got there, they didn't even have a hospital.
Oh, wow.
That would be to a standard where myself or my family felt comfortable going to. These things over time were built up, but it took a little time for that development to sort of catch up to the standards that we were used to. So some of the things that we were exposed to on a personal level, the hospital and then the school, where literally there was only one school. So you have one choice in the international school system to go to. So it's a good school or a bad school, you got no choice.
Right.
So those were, I think, part of the acclimatization process that we went through, or getting used to living there. Those were the tougher challenges on the personal side because there just wasn't that same level of support or kind of connectivity to what we were used to coming from. The
Right.
professional side was actually a little bit easier simply because as the general manager, I was responsible for setting this up, and I was making the decisions that were in the best interest of the company and could take those decisions however I felt they were appropriate.
Right.
In terms of hiring people and bringing the right people in and being selective and going through those processes. So I think that process was a lot more quick for me personally.
Right.
But the personal side and my family getting used to being there was a little bit more challenging. And to put a specific example would be my kids were going to a school where the population was roughly 60% Korean.
Okay.
Because Samsung had a huge corporate base in this particular town that we lived in. That's great because there's a lot of diversity, but at the same time, your standards in your classroom, particularly in an international school where the medium of communication should be English, was not always as easy a transition for kids that didn't speak English as a native language.
Exactly.
Or in my case, my kids' case, all the other Koreans were speaking with each other in Korean, and so my kids weren't necessarily understanding what was happening either. So it was really kind of a challenge on a lot of different levels.
Right, right. Now, I've seen that you said your kids have experienced some adversity for not knowing the language. What type of training did your family have coming over, or were any of your kids born there?
It's a two-part question. The first part is that on the training side, we didn't have any training. My wife and I both came from a similar background where we had language training before we went, but not through sponsored by the programs or the companies that we worked for, but that was our choice in terms of in our undergraduate careers, was we both studied Chinese.
Okay.
So that was helpful for us to make the transition, but my kids were actually, two of my kids were born in Hong Kong, one was born in Shanghai, and one was born here in the U.S.
Okay.
So, and they didn't have any linguistic training or cross-cultural training or any kind of training. They just showed up and that was it. And you just have to kind of learn as you go.
Okay. Were you still on assignment when you last, when the one that was born in the U.S. was born?
No, I had two kids in Hong Kong. We moved back to the U.S.
Okay.
For about 3 years. Then I took a new assignment with another firm, and then we moved over to Taiwan actually for a short period of time, and then transitioned over to Suzhou.
Okay.
And then my youngest was born in Shanghai.
Okay. I just known that with some corporate policies, being able to have access to certain hospitals or have access to medical care back in the U.S., I was just wondering, were they clear or were they tailor-made really to your family situation?
Some of the policies were not. They were more general policies that we sort of followed, and I worked in the instance of my youngest son being born. We had just switched over to this new policy. The corporation did switched over to this new policy, and the HR folks had to work really hard to actually have that be covered, because my wife was pregnant at the time, and that was considered a pre-existing condition. And they said, "Well, we're not going to cover you." But the HR folks here said, "Wait a second."
Right.
Our whole company's switching over to this new policy, and he is a member of this company, and so therefore we need to work together because we have choices in terms of our health care. So actually in that case, and you prompted some memory there, that the HR folks here did a very good job. So even the corporate policy was standard or very general, they actually did do a very good job of pulling together sort of and meeting our needs, knowing that this was a challenging time for us personally to sort of get stuck in a new environment,
exactly.
But also, and professionally because it was a brand new company. So I think they tried to help to lessen the burden or sort of take away some of that pressure. And there was one person in particular who, the HR lead director, who really got stuck in and just made this happen. And it was very, very much appreciated.
Oh, definitely. At least they could help with the transition if they didn't get the training in the beginning.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So tell me about some day-to-day experiences. How was commuting and shopping?
That was a bit of a challenge sometimes. We had a car and a driver, because the company policies were such that we were not allowed to drive. My children were going to school on a bus that was provided by the school, so the school would have, wherever the kids were living, different kids living all over in different compounds, they would arrange bus schedules that picked up the kids in different places. And so they would be responsible for picking them up at the house and then bringing them home at the end of the day, much like we have here in the U.S. But on the days where those schedules weren't matching up, or it wasn't convenient, or say the kids had sports after school or something and they only had one set of buses, it was a little more challenging. But because we had a car and a driver and some flexibility there, we could send the driver to meet different members of the family depending on the needs.
Right.
So the priority was, if I needed something for the corporate reasons to go somewhere, do something, so I was taking the car and driver, and then my kids would have to figure stuff out and my wife would have to figure things out. But I tried to balance my schedule to allow for that flexibility too. And if I was just going to be at the plant all day and my wife needed to get around and shop and that sort of thing, the driver would go back, pick her up, and take her around to the places she needed to go to get the day-to-day needs sorted out.
Okay. So were there any big differences in shopping specifically, preparing for holidays maybe, any differences in product quality?
Yeah, actually there were. I think that was one of the bigger challenges day to day, until you got settled into a routine where my wife would have to go to 6 or 7 shops just to find the ingredients for a particular meal that she wanted to prepare. That was, and not all these meals were very fancy or gourmet or anything. These we're talking some basic meals. You know, making, let's say, chicken fajitas or something, and you have to get sort of the spice packets and the chicken and then the wraps and the cheese and the sour cream. All those ingredients have to come from 5 different places.
Oh, wow.
So that was something that, and you didn't really know about that until you actually kind of got stuck into it and said, hey, what am I going to prepare for dinner, and how's it going to work? And so you go and think you can go to the local supermarket or the local Sam's Club and pick up the things you need and go home. It's not that easy.
Right.
Those big box retailers, as I call them, they were more geared towards the bulk items. You know, so you get your milk and your cereal, much like you do at a Costco here, right? As an example, get your bigger items in one place, and then your smaller day-to-day things, you maybe go to the local fresh market to get your vegetables, and then you go to this market to get some of the other ingredients. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge, until you can navigate your way through and say, okay, I know this shop has these sets of things, and I know this shop has these sets of things. And for that convenience, I guess, even though it was very inconvenient to go to these things, you're actually paying a heck of a lot more than you would if you just shop local.
Oh, really?
But your question about the product quality was interesting, in that, much like what people may have heard about in terms of the quality of milk and there being some food scandals and that sort of thing in China.
Sugar and baby formula, that kind of stuff.
All that kind of crazy things. There's some substitutions that weren't so great. We were also concerned about that, and that was something that we made a conscious decision to say, hey, there's maybe an expense to some of these products that we're purchasing, but we felt more comfortable buying some of these imported products.
Right.
And, you know, even if it was milk from New Zealand, or spices from the U.S., or meat in a lot of cases. I actually developed a relationship with a local hotel who imported meats from Australia and the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And I piggybacked off of the hotel so that I could service my own family and knew where the meat was coming from, to the degree that I did the research all the way back to the farm. But do I really know that somebody didn't just stick a label on the packet of meat and say it came from that farm? Don't know.
Wow.
But I can only think that because they're servicing the hotel, that they're a reputable provider, and so you have to trust to a certain degree.
Exactly. So it sounds like you found yourself a pretty good corporate culture and a pretty good sense of community. So I got one more question for you. If you could get a message from the present to the past, what advice would you give yourself?
I guess it would be any of the challenges that you face sort of on a day-to-day level, whether they be personal challenges in trying to provide for your family, or whether it be corporate challenges, because of the sort of growth of the business or the needs of the business, that sort of thing. I guess my advice to myself would be to slow down and sort of take these in and not get so frustrated with the fact that these are challenges that may seem important, but they're really not in the bigger context. These are things that it's called experience, really.
Right.
And you got to go through some of these hardships in order to understand what is critical to, in the business case, critical to the business succeeding. And in your personal side, what's critical to the well-being and health of your family.
Right.
And you got to find some of those areas that, you know, you got to find the balancing act. You got to do that pretty well. And I think as a younger guy, when I first started off in the international scene, I was frustrated by a lot of different things.
Right.
Both personally and professionally, and really in operating in Asia, in my case, it was at a time too where there wasn't much support from Western, the Western side. I'd get the phone call support, but I was the only guy on the ground. So
right.
Where are you going to turn? And I think that was also part of the frustrating piece. But I think if I fast forward to 20 years later and think about all that stuff, those were things that just I could have navigated and probably not been as stressed about.
Right. And the world kind of caught up too, because everybody's getting more interconnected, and it's easier to be able to communicate, and there's so many different forms.
Yeah, I suppose that's true too. I hadn't really made that connector, but it's true. I think something as simple as Skype, as
right.
an example, being able to communicate, being able to see people, you have a question, you have that connectivity, right? Whereas sort of when I was operating on the ground, these things were there, sure, but not as readily available as they are today. I mean, you can literally take your smartphone today and take a video of something, send that file back to someone, a technician in the US who's running 24/7, and say, hey guys, what am I looking at here?
Right.
And you can get a pretty quick answer.
Right.
Whereas a lot of that stuff I had to sort of figure out on my own and say, I don't know what I'm looking at, but let's see what we come up with.
Right. Well, I really appreciate your time, and we hope to be connecting more soon.
No problem. You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a good one.